Good afternoon to everyone who has joined today. I have the pleasure of welcoming all of you today to the seminar co-hosted by BSR and Jipyong. And we are very excited to have you all to discuss the latest trends of human rights due diligence legislation and corporate practices in implementing human rights due diligence in the supply chains. And then when it comes to the Q&A session, I'd like to inform that for online participants, please use the Q&A chat box at the bottom of the screen to raise the questions to the experts which you may have. And for on-site participants, please raise up your hands at the Q&A session, which is the very end of the second session. And if you raise up your hands and then our staff give you a microphone, and then the official language, as you are already informed, that official language is English for the seminar, but when it comes to the Q&A session, for the on-site participants, please use whichever language you feel comfortable with. And without any further ado, we will move into the opening remarks. And then I would like to introduce Aron CRAMER, CEO and President of BSR, for his opening remarks. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Aron CRAMER, the President and CEO, and I'm delighted to be with you virtually as we kick off another seminar in the series in which BSR is partnering with Jipyong LLC. We're really delighted that you're with us, both in person in Seoul and also virtually all across Asia. Today's topic is a really important one. We're taking on the question of human rights due diligence, specifically for companies from Asia and operating in Asia. And this is a topic that is growing in importance in really significant ways. We have obviously regulations coming certainly from Europe, also from the United States, and also other locations. We have a rising set of expectations on the part of stakeholders. And importantly, investors are asking a lot of questions now about what companies are doing to ensure that they're protecting human rights as a way to ensure that the company is stewarding itself properly. So it's a very timely and important subject. We're delighted to be joined today with speakers not only from BSR and Jipyong, but also from the United Nations and also leading companies from South Korea, from Japan, and from Singapore, and of course, joined by all of you. And I hope that this will be a really good dialogue. The time is now to ensure that human rights are protected by business, on the part of business. It's the right thing for the wider world, and it also really helps a company manage risk and look to build solid relationships with people and communities. So we're delighted that you're with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to hand over to Taek Lim, Managing Director at Jipyong, who will be joining us through video recording. Thank you.
안녕하세요. 오늘 BSR과 공동으로 주최하는 세미나에 많이 참석해 주셔서 진심으로 감사드립니다. 오늘 저는 두 가지 말씀을 드리고 싶습니다. 첫 번째, 인권실사를 비용 또는 부담이라고만 생각하지 말고 그것이 오히려 기회이고 경쟁력이라는 관점을 가지는 회사들이 많아지면 좋겠습니다. 인권을 존중하는 기업에는 사람들이 몰리고 소비자들도 그런 기업을 선호합니다. 투자자들도 인권을 투자의 중요한 기준으로 설정하는 시대가 되었습니다. 반면 인권을 소홀히 하는 기업은 불매운동의 대상이 되고 공급망에서도 불리한 위치에 처하게 됩니다. 인권 문제는 통상 문제가 되었고 그리고 이해관계자의 가장 중요한 관심사가 되었습니다. 둘째, 인권실사를 깊이 있게 실행해 보는 기업이 많아지면 좋겠습니다. 인권 부서를 두거나 인권 전문가를 영입해 보는 것은 어떨까요? 아동노동, 강제노동, 결사의 자유를 이행하고 있는지 체크리스트에 형식적으로 체크하는 정도의 인권 영역 평가를 벗어나서 깊이 있게 제3자를 통한 인권 실사를 실행해 보는 것은 어떨까요? 우리는 아직 형식적으로 인권 실사를 하는 수준에 머물러 있는 것 같습니다. 공급망을 선택할 때 인권을 기준으로 선택하고 공급망을 관리하며 지원하는 회사도 많지 않습니다. 인권 보고서를 발간하는 회사는 정말 극소수에 불과하지요. 많은 기업들이 사회공헌을 하지만 지역사회 인권 문제를 해결하기 위한 지역사회 참여 활동을 적극적으로 하는 기업도 아직은 많지 않습니다. 앞으로 인권 경영이 보다 실질적으로 내재화되어서 진정성 있게 인권 문제를 기업의 문제로 천착하는 그런 기업들이 많아지면 좋겠습니다. 모쪼록 오늘 세미나가 여러분들의 회사의 인권 경영을 발전시켜 나가는 데 큰 도움이 되기를 바랍니다.
We will now begin the opening remarks, keynote presentations. When it comes to the keynote presentation, Asako Nagai, director at BSR, will moderate and welcome and introduce the keynote speakers. So I would like to hand it over to Asako Nagai.
Yes, thank you very much for the keynote presentation. I'm going to make the introduction. Hello, everyone. This is Asako Nagai. I'm a managing director of BSR, global organization working on sustainability with a business network and consultancy. I'm based in Tokyo. I'm honored to introduce you today our distinguished two keynote speakers. Both have been dedicated their time towards working on raising awareness of and help support implementation of UN guiding principles on business and human rights, naming UNGP to business community and the broader value chain that business community operates. One from a government perspective and another from a UN perspective. I have been very fortunate to be able to work with them both and extremely impressed by both of their dedication and sometimes passionate about business and human rights and how they act on protecting human rights of the people. Let me introduce you today our first keynote speaker, Pichamon YEOPHANTONG, member of UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. She's also working with Deakin University in Australia, head of research and associate professor of Center for Future National Defense at university. Please welcome Pichamon, and I'll hand it on to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Asako, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Good afternoon to everyone. 안녕하세요. My name, as Asako has already pointed out, is Pichamon YEOPHANTONG. I am a UN independent expert, member of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, which I will tell you a little bit more about over the course of this presentation. But before I go into the main part of my presentation, I just wanted to say that these types of seminars are extremely important. They're important not only in terms of raising awareness of what the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights stand for, but they're also important as a platform to share learnings, to raise also understanding of what is happening in our region. And so for that reason, it's really, I am thankful to both BSR and to Jipyong for making this happen. And I very much hope that this will be the beginning of many more events that the working group can contribute to with both organizations. And so now into the main part of my presentation. What I'd like to talk to you a bit more about today is really about the guiding principles, but also what the major trends are as we look ahead at the next decade of implementation. So allow me to share my screen. And I believe everyone should be able to see my screen now. Let me tell you a little bit more about the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights in case some of you might not have heard about us before. We're basically part of what are known as special procedures. Special procedures sit within the United Nations system, and they are part of the UN Human Rights Council. Special procedures are comprised of independent, expert, fact-finding, and monitoring mechanisms of the Human Rights Council. There are basically a range of mandates that have been established by different Human Rights Council resolutions, which include, for instance, mandates on the environment, on climate change, on the rights of women and children and girls. Also, there are country mandates, such as those on Cambodia, the occupied Palestinian territory, and a range of others. And so the mandate of the the mandate of the working group is business and human rights, very obviously. The business and human rights mandate itself emerged with the unanimous endorsement of the guiding principles back in 2011. As I think many of you might already be aware, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights represent a global normative framework with a very strong political foundation. They represent the very first set of authoritative global standards in the space of business and human rights. The guiding principles have since been endorsed by global business organizations, civil society, as well as national human rights institutions, and needless to say, governments as well. And in fact, 2021, 2 years ago, we actually passed the 10-year mark of the guiding principles establishment. I don't want to belabor this point too much, but I really cannot emphasize enough the importance of the guiding principles and the fact that we are now in the second decade of global implementation. As you can see here from the slide, there's been a real convergence when it comes to global frameworks and standards pertaining to business and human rights. Of course, I've put at the center here the UN framework when it comes to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. But as you can see, the guiding principles themselves are very much aligned, but are also in constant communication with the OECD guidelines, for instance, on responsible business conduct, the ILO's multinational enterprise declaration, M&E declaration. They're also in alignment with the IFC and a range of other safeguards as well. And so when it comes to understanding why the guiding principles are so impactful, we need to, of course, bear in mind that even though these are guiding principles, they're guidelines, and as you'll see in the next slide, they don't actually present new legal obligations, but instead elaborate on existing ones for states as well as for business. It's really the fact that they apply to all states, that they apply to all companies of all sizes in every sector, in any country, and the fact that they are distinct and yet highlight the complementary obligations and responsibilities between states and businesses. And so it's in light of that the guiding principles are novel, and it's also the fact that they don't preclude additional or future responsibilities from occurring for businesses as well, that allows them to really respond to the situation as it evolves on the ground. And as I've already said, even though the guiding principles aren't legally binding, they are very much based on binding norms. They also don't derogate from binding rules, and they could, in fact, become binding by virtue of legislation, judicial decisions, or other forces, such as those that I'm sure will be discussed today in terms of the mandatory waive when it comes to human rights due diligence. And again, I cannot emphasize enough the fact that the guiding principles have been widely accepted by all stakeholders. And so I won't go into too much detail here about the three-pillar framework that really underpins the guiding principles, but it's important to, of course, note that the guiding principles are very clear about the state duty to protect, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, as well as the importance of access to remedy. And at the heart of the guiding principles, one can argue, is really the idea or the concept of human rights due diligence. Again, I won't go into great detail with respect to this slide, but suffice it to say that human rights due diligence is very much about anticipating, mitigating, and really addressing both the potential and the actual adverse human rights impacts that business activities can have. And it's about taking all reasonable precautions in order to prevent human rights harm. And so in light of all of this, we're at a moment where we really need to, in one sense, take a little bit of a step back and try to assess where we are. How far have we come over the past decade, and what is the road like that lies ahead for us over the next decade? And so the working group itself has actually conducted a project, the UNGP's 10+, which is aimed at taking stock of how much progress we've been able to accomplish over the past decade, but also to really highlight some of the areas that still need additional work. And so here, the working group found that the guiding principles have provided a common platform for action that did not exist prior to 2011. We've also seen how the principles have helped to popularize the concept of human rights due diligence, as well as the importance of attaining that smart mix of both voluntary and mandatory measures in the business and human rights space. We've also seen a significant uptake of the guiding principles and human rights due diligence in particular by a range of actors. This ranges from obviously the large businesses, but also financial institutions through to some of the smaller and medium-sized enterprises. But of course, more action is always needed. And here we still see a real need for states to develop relevant guidelines, laws, and action plans on business and human rights, and the need for more businesses to implement human rights due diligence. And here, it's really very much the case that looking at the Asia-Pacific region, not only do we still need more awareness raising about the guiding principles, but also the idea of human rights due diligence, but it's especially important that awareness is raised amongst the smaller and medium-sized enterprises that are so crucial to economic activity in this region. And I won't go into this in great detail, but the working group did highlight 8 priority action areas as part of its stock-taking exercise. Here you have areas such as just transition, digital transformation, and of course, policy coherence. And as part of all of that, the working group also found that there are some really important trends on the horizon or that are already underway that we are keeping a very close eye on. Chief amongst that is, of course, the so-called mandatory wave, or really the growth in mandatory human rights due diligence measures that we are seeing on a global scale. This pertains, of course, to business and human rights related legislation, such as those that have been put in place in the United Kingdom and in Australia, France, and Germany, and of course, the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. At the same time, we're also seeing more guidelines coming into place, including Japan's guidelines on respecting human rights and responsible supply chains. And these are promising trends. It's very much important, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, to see a greater push towards mandatory human rights due diligence, and again, to ensure that there is that smart mix when it comes to both voluntary and mandatory measures. We've also been seeing quite the proliferation of national action plans on business and human rights, especially here in Asia. Most recently, there's been the Mongolian National Action Plan that's been announced, Indonesia as well, and Malaysia is currently in the midst of developing its National Action Plan. And again, this is a very positive development. At the same time, we have to be mindful that these National Action Plans are not a panacea when it comes to business-related human rights abuses. They can serve as a guidance, as a framework, but really what matters is implementation and enforcement. And again, this is where we see a number of challenges occur, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. And so in the interest of time, I won't go into each of these points in great detail, but suffice it to note here that again, it's very, very important that there is a smart mix of mandatory and voluntary policy and regulatory measures at both the national and international levels. And here the guiding principles are still important. Even with mandatory human rights due diligence measures put in place, the guiding principles serve, in one sense, an even broader function in terms of ensuring that there is a common language that is used in this space. And so it's very important that whatever mandatory human rights due diligence measure comes into existence, that they are closely aligned and cohere with the guiding principles. It's also important to note that even though the guiding principles themselves do not explicitly mention the environment, environmental damage is very much included in the scope of the UNGPs. And this, of course, is reflected in the fact that the right to a clean, safe, healthy, and sustainable environment has been recognized as a human right by the UN General Assembly. And then as we see more and more mandatory human rights due diligence measures come into being, at least that is what I hope we will be seeing in the coming years, if not across this next decade, there needs to be an avoidance of a box-ticking mentality towards enforcement and implementation. What this means is that, even if there are laws in place, we need to ensure that they are being implemented. And a really important part of this is ensuring access to justice, as well as access to remedy by those who are adversely impacted by business-related human rights abuses. And so in light of that, multi-stakeholder engagement and dialogue is incredibly important. And this is why, again, I said at the outset that these types of seminars, these types of events are very valuable in order to raise awareness and also build the momentum in support of the business and human rights agenda. And so I just really wanted to bring your attention here to the fact that amongst the three pillars of the guiding principles, the access to remedy pillar is one of the underdeveloped ones. Even though most stakeholders that I've spoken to in the Asia Pacific region are aware of the importance of ensuring access to effective remedy by individuals, by communities impacted negatively by business-related human rights abuses, how this can actually happen, what constitutes effective remedy, is not something that is still widely understood, and a lot more capacity building is required in that regard. And so while I won't go into the third pillar here and what more needs to be done, I really wanted to bring your attention to this issue because businesses play an incredibly important role when it comes to ensuring access to remedy. And this is a pillar where, again, we need to work collectively to ensure that whatever remedies are provided to victims, that they are effective, that they are suitable, and that they are also intersectional and take into consideration the unique circumstances of victims themselves. And so just to wrap up, I wanted to note that the working group is very much interested and keen in engaging with all of you. Even though I can't be there in person with all of you, I very much hope that you will get in touch with the working group so that we can talk more about these issues and work together in order to advance the business and human rights agenda. And more specifically, I hope that you will consider engaging more with us on some of these different areas that we work in. For instance, the working group, as part of our mandated activities, we conduct country visits in order to better understand the business and human rights situation in different countries across the world. Our most recent visit was, in fact, to Japan. And again, I must thank the Japanese government for hosting us and for inviting us to come into the country and better understand what's happening there. And previously, earlier in the year, I also led a delegation to Argentina. The working group also publishes annual thematic reports to the Human Rights Council as well as to the General Assembly. And on the slide, you can see some of the topics that we've worked on most recently that I think will be of interest to many people in this room as well. All of this can be found online, by the way. There are a range of other channels or avenues for engagement also, but the one that I really want to bring your attention to is our upcoming annual forum on business and human rights that will happen at the Palais des Nations in Geneva from the 27th to the 29th of November this year. I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have offline about the forum. But this is something that the working group does every single year, and it is in fact the largest gathering on business and human rights in the world. And so I very much hope that we'll be seeing many of you there in Geneva next month, or rather this month. I forget, it's already November actually, but I very much look forward to seeing many of you there. And again, also to working more with all of you on business and human rights, but also specifically on advancing the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And with that, I'm going to hand over back to Asako so that you can proceed with our next keynote speaker. But thank you so much again for your time and attention.
Thank you very much for your great outlining and presentation, and thank you for your participation in your very busy time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will begin the first session, and the first session have the presentation by the two experts from BSR and Jipyong respectively, and KUSBIANTORO, director at BSR, and Chang, partner at Jipyong. So I would like to introduce the first presenter, who is Rosa KUSBIANTORO.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rosa KUSBIANTORO. I'm a director of BSR based in the Singapore office. And today, we will be going over some global legislative trends in relation to mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. So first off, we'd like to share that, as we can see, there have been various human rights regulations which have been introduced since 2000. The number of regulations that has been introduced significantly increased since the introduction of the UN Guiding Principles in 2011. And what we've also have seen that government efforts to date have primarily concentrated on voluntary measures, asking companies to increase their transparency, with lots of focus on the parent or lead companies' activities. However, unfortunately, it has also been observed that there hasn't been truly a corresponding improvement in conditions for workers or communities in global supply chains whose human rights have been impacted by businesses. As a result, what we are seeing increasingly in the past couple of years is the introduction of mandatory human rights disclosure and due diligence laws. So these are seen as a missing link to help achieve the corporate accountability objectives, which were originally envisaged by the voluntary legislation, which was previously introduced. And there are basically four buckets of human rights regulations, which we've seen emerging. So the first is in relation to disclosure requirements or reporting requirements. So these are basically requirements for businesses which fall within the scope of relevant regulations to prepare a statement which outlines the steps that they are taking to prevent human rights risks or impacts, for example, modern slavery, in their own operations as well as in their supply chains. The second bucket is in relation to mandatory due diligence. So this basically is a set of requirements for businesses, again, which fall in scope of the requirements to carry out due diligence for actual or potential adverse human rights impacts in their own operations and value chains. Some trends that we'd like to highlight are, we've seen an emerging announcement of regional-wide legislation, for example, the EU Draft Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence, which our colleagues from Jipyong will elaborate in further detail. We've also seen new requirements across geographies being introduced as well. For example, South Korea is currently considering the introduction of mandatory due diligence. New Zealand as well is considering the introduction of this as well. And the third bucket, which we'd like to highlight, is in relation to sanctions and penalties. So a variety of instruments, including import and export restrictions or bans on goods suspected of being made using, human rights related violations such as forced labor, and also entities with suspected involvement or use of forced labor. There are sanctions that have been placed against individuals as well as entities linked to these violations. So again, we've also seen an emerging issuance of regional-wide legislation. For example, the EU recently introduced a forced labor proposal that will prohibit the placing on the EU market products which are made by forced labor. So this is, market prohibition measure. And the fourth bucket is in relation to public procurement. A number of regulations have also been introduced to combat human rights violations, such as human trafficking, and to protect other human rights in federal procurement supply chains. So, for example, Canada recently introduced an updated code, which outlines the government's expectations related to human and labor rights for the government's vendors and also their subcontractors. So, because as we all know as well, the EU has been leading the way in terms of the integration of human rights due diligence obligations across various proposals. So just to highlight, there are a couple of regulations which are already in force. For example, the deforestation regulation, the batteries regulation, which again, our colleagues from Jipyong will elaborate in further detail. Also, the corporate sustainability reporting directive, which it's important to note, it does link the assessment of material topics to due diligence and also requires reporting on due diligence measures that the company has already taken to identify what topics are material. Likewise, some high-profile proposals, which are being monitored closely, such as the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Again, look forward to the next session from our colleagues from Jipyong. Just like to highlight a bit in terms of the EU efforts to integrate good governance into human rights agenda. Since 2020, the EU has actually been considering how issues around good governance should also be integrated. So there is a prevailing view that the lack of good governance contributes to negative human rights impacts, including negative environmental impacts such as deforestation. And so these introductions are meant to incentivize local practices in terms of ensuring good governance. So the Parliament proposed 2 legal initiatives, the deforestation, which became the Deforestation Regulation, and also the Corporate Due Diligence and Accountability Initiative, which became the CSDDD. And both of these initiatives actually include good governance provisions. So, for example, the Deforestation Regulation prohibits the import, sale, or export of certain products, for example, cattle, cocoa, coffee, etc., unless they are deforestation-free and also produced in accordance with the relevant legislation of the country of production. And this includes legislation related to tax, anti-corruption, trade and customs regulation. So again, it is important for companies to keep in mind that the requirements for due diligence and risk assessment cover good governance aspects as well. And very briefly, in addition to the EU, other governments are also, of course, advancing their human rights and environmental due diligence requirements as well. So we've seen that in Canada, United States, other parts of the Americas, and in Asia in particular. We've already heard in great detail from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, Ms. Namatsui-san. And also we've heard, from our colleagues from Jipyong and also through media about the South Korean plans as well to introduce mandatory human rights due diligence in the future. Australia as well already has a Modern Slavery Act in place, but based on a recent review, which they completed earlier this year, there are recommendations that have been made to strengthen the requirements that will be placed on companies to fulfill requirements of this act moving forward. So very briefly, in South Korea, we have seen since 2022, there are already discussions, recommendations that have been made in terms of making mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence as a key element for the government to work on. Also, there have already been proposals introduced to strengthen the human rights responsibility of companies operating in conflict areas and high-risk areas. And most recently, we've noted that the Democratic Party has proposed a bill on human rights and environmental protection for sustainable business management, which would require companies to establish systems to identify, assess, manage, and disclose human rights and environmental risk. And based on our initial review, we note that the proposed act does cover core elements of corporate human rights and environmental due diligence as laid out in the UNGPs and also OECD guidelines. And for the first time in Korea, the bill would prescribe corporate responsibility to respect human rights and environmental due diligence, and also stipulate the corporate duty to conduct this due diligence. The bill also has definitions or expectations in terms of the supply chain as business relationships, falling under coverage of the bill, both direct as well as indirect suppliers, at every stage of a company's value chain. So again, this is something which is continuing to be monitored, and this is something that is really a key development, I think, for the Asia Pacific region. For Japan, and I won't elaborate further, as there is already the excellent overview from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We would just like to highlight that these developments are also being monitored by other governments in the region, and would also affect, of course, operations in Southeast Asian countries for companies who are based in Japan and then also in Korea. Just a final point, for the Australian Modern Slavery Act, after its enforcement in 2019, the government, they had made a commitment to review the act every 3 years. Based on the results which are shared in May 2023, there are significant requirements which will be strengthened, including particularly due diligence obligations for companies, and also the introduction of penalties for non-compliance as well. So this means instead of the previous requirement, which just which just asked for companies to report on what they're doing in terms of preventing or addressing modern slavery, companies are required to build a human rights due diligence management system and report on it in quite detail. So again, these are just some trends which we have noticed, and I think it's something which really is in line with what the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, Pichamon, just shared, as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I think I'd like to stop the overview now and hand it over to our colleagues from Jipyong to share some detailed requirements related to some of the regulations which I just mentioned. Thank you.
예, 저는 지평의 민창욱 변호사입니다. 여기 오늘 세미나가 공식 언어가 영어인데 영어로 발표를 하려다가 어제 밤에 생각해 보니까 오바인 것 같아가지고요. 여기 오신 분들도 결코 영어 발표를 원하시지 않을 것 같다는 합리화를 하면서 저는 한글로 얘기를 하겠습니다. 먼저 글로벌 실사 동향에 대해서 잘 설명해 주신 BSR의 로사께 감사의 말씀을 드리고요. 저는 오늘 EU의 실사법제가 아시아 기업에 미치는 영향, 그중에 그룹 단위 실사와 책임 있는 조달을 중심으로 간단히 한 10분 정도 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 먼저 그룹 단위 실사가 올해 6월에 채택된 CSDDD 의회 승인안에서 들어왔는데요. 먼저 적용 대상 기업에 그룹의 최종 모회사라는 개념이 들어왔습니다. 그래서 이 표의 이제 세 번째 카테고리를 보면 non EU 컴퍼니 중에 1억 5천만 유로 이상의 전 세계 순매출이 있고 그중에 4천만 유로 정도가 EU 지역에서 발생을 하면 이제 적용 대상이 되는데요. 이런 개별 기업 단위 말고 그룹 단위로 그룹 전체의 순매출이 1억 5천만 유로를 넘고 그중에 4천만 유로 이상이 EU 지역에서 발생을 하고 그룹 전체의 임직원이 500명을 넘었을 경우에는 이 그룹의 최종 모회사, 즉 지주회사가 적용 대상에 포함이 됩니다. 이거는 좀 더 구체적인 요건인데 그냥 자료로 살펴보시면 좋을 것 같고요. 그래서 이게 개별 기업이든 지주사건 CSDDD에 적용 대상 기업이 되면 실사 의무를 부담을 하게 됩니다. 이 실사 의무는 여기 6가지가 나와 있는데 첫 번째 인권 정책을 만들어야 되고 두 번째에서 다섯 번째는 이제 인권 실사를 하라는 거고 여섯 번째가 이제 고충 처리 절차를 운영하라는 거라서 이거는 UNGP나 OECD 가이드라인에 나와 있는 내용의 어떤 프레임워크와 동일하다라고 보셔도 될 것 같고요. 근데 문제는 여기 2번에서 보시다시피 이제 빨간색 표시를 해놨는데 실사의 범위가 우리 적용 대상 기업의 자체 사업장, 오운 오퍼레이션 말고 자회사와 밸류체인이 포함되어 있습니다. 근데 이게 개별 기업이 아니고 최종 모회사가 적용 대상 기업이 되면 최종 모회사의 자회사가 실사의 대상에 포함이 되게 되거든요. 그래서 이 부분이 제가 생각하기로는 실사의 중복, 실사 범위의 중복 내지 실사 범위의 확장으로 이어지는 것 같습니다. 좀 예를 들어 설명을 드리면 뭐 한국에 한 기업 집단이 있다고 가정을 해보겠습니다. 이게 뭐 예를 들어 LG그룹이다라고 했을 때 LG전자 같은 경우는 EU 지역에서 상당한 순매출이 발생을 하기 때문에 개별 기업으로서 실사법의 적용을 받겠죠. 근데 이게 개별 기업이 아니고 그룹 차원에서 보면 LG그룹도 이 EU 지역에서 매출이 발생을 하고 있고 전체 임직원이 500명이 넘기 때문에 LG그룹의 최종 모회사인 주식회사 LG가 적용 대상 기업이 됩니다. 그런데 이 주식회사 LG는 그 자회사인 subsidiary에 대해서 실사를 할 의무를 부담을 하거든요. 그러면 LG전자의 입장에서는 본인은 실사 의무를 이행할 주체이고 모회사로부터 실사를 받을 객체가 됩니다. 그래서 저는 이것이 실사가 오버랩된다, 중복되는 것 같다라는 이제 표현을 쓰고요. 더 나아가서 살펴보면 주LG는 이때 제가 드린 말씀은 LG전자가 CSDDD상 subsidiary 요건에 해당한다는 걸 전제로 말씀드리는 겁니다. 이건 검토가 필요하고요. 더 나아가서 모회사는 모든 자회사들에게 실사 의무를 부담하기 때문에 유럽 비즈니스를 하지 않는 국내 자회사에도 실사를 해야 되는 이처럼 이제 실사의 범위가 확장되는 효과가 발생을 하는 것 같습니다. 그래서 이런 이슈들이 새로 생기는 것 같고 이와 관련해서 이번에 의회 승인안의 4조 A를 보면 그룹 단위 실사 지원이라는 조항이 추가되었습니다. 여기를 읽어보면 특정 조건을 갖춘 경우에 그룹의 모회사가 자회사의 실사를 지원할 수 있다라는 조항이 들어왔는데요. 여기에 그 특정 조건이란 자회사가 관련된 정보를 제공하고 실사에 협력하는 것, 그리고 자회사가 모회사의 폴리시에 따르는 것, 그리고 모회사와 자회사가 공동으로 대응할 이슈에 대해서 서로 소통하고 협력하는 것, 이런 것들이 이제 전제가 되어 있습니다. 그래서 그룹 단위 실사는 굉장히 이거를 잘 이행하려면 정책도 통일을 해야 되고 정보 공유도 잘해야 되는 어떤 그런 이슈가 발생을 하게 되는 것 같습니다. 그래서 이 조항에 대한 그냥 개인적 해석으로 어떻게 그룹 단위 실사를 효율적으로 효과적으로 시행할 수 있을 것이냐에 대해서 이게 그룹 실사 협약을 체결하는 게 어떻겠느냐라는 생각을 해보았습니다. 우리가 이제 삼성그룹이 전자를 포함해서 7개 계열사가 준법감시위원회 운영에 관한 협약을 체결하지 않았습니까? 이런 것처럼 그룹 단위에서 협약을 체결해서 모자 회사의 정보 공유 범위라든지 협력의 범위라든지 혹은 정책을 어떻게 통일시킬 것이라든지 이런 것들을 잘 이렇게 합의를 하고 그것 따라 이제 진행을 하게 되면 여기 그룹 단위의 듀딜리전스를 좀 더 효과적으로 수행할 수 있지 않을까. 네, 이제 이런 말씀을 드렸고요. 여기까지가 이제 그룹 단위 실사고 책임 있는 조달과 관련해서 조금 말씀을 드리면 이제 EU 산림벌채 규정이 올해 6월부터 발효가 된 것 같습니다. 근데 산림벌채 규정은 EU 시장의 어떤 특정한 품목, 재료나 어떤 상품을 이렇게 출시하는 기업들에게 적용이 될 텐데요. 여기 그 자료에서 보시면 왼쪽에 이제 숲과 이제 농장에서 예를 들어 팜오일이나 고무나 목재 등을 이렇게 채취를 해가지고 이 재료를 가지고 이제 상품을 만들겠죠. 예를 들어 팜오일이면은 뭐 식품이라든지 그리고 고무라면은 타이어 그리고 목재라면은 가구 등을 만들어서 EU에 출시하는 사업자 또는 이게 유통업자들의 이제 EUDR이 EU 산림범죄법이 이제 적용이 되게 됩니다. 그런데 EUDR은 여기 보시면 이게 S&P 글로벌의 최근 자료인 것 같은데 이 목재나 팜오일이나 어떤 그 고무나 이런 것들은 저기 말레이시아나 인도네시아, 이 동남아시아 쪽에서 주로 이제 조달이 되고요. 이 원료들을 조달을 받아서 유럽에 수출하는 뭐 한국의 가구 업체, 한국의 타이어 업체, 그리고 한국의 식품 회사들이 이 직접 또는 간접적으로 EUDR에 적용을 받게 되는 것 같습니다. 그러면 이 EUDR이 뭘 규정하고 있냐라고 했을 때 별도의 실사 의무를 규정을 하고 있죠. 그래서 EUDR은 그 제품을 EU에 출시하기 전에 EUDR 3조의 요건을 준수하는지를 증명하기 위해서 실사를 해야 된다라고 규정을 하고 있습니다. 근데 그 3조가 뭐라고 이게 되어 있냐면요. 세 가지 관련된 품목이나 상품은 세 가지를 준수해야 된다, 지켜야 된다. 첫째는 산림벌채와 무관하다, 디포레스테이션 프리여야 되고, 그 다음은 생산국의 현지 법령들을 모두 준수해야 된다. 그리고 듀딜리전스 선언서를 제출해야 된다. 이렇게 세 가지 의무를 부과하고 있습니다. 그러면 이 산림벌채 규정에서 말하는 실사 의무는 뭐냐? 세 가지인데 첫 번째가 우리 기업이 이 제3조를 준수하고 있다는 정보를 수집하는 게 이제 첫 번째고요. 두 번째는 리스크 평가로서 이 수집된 정보가 정확하냐 이렇게 해서 검증하고 분석하는 것이 이제 두 번째고요. 세 번째는 리스크가 있으면 완화 조치를 취해서 리스크를 제거하거나 혹은 아주 미미한 리스크가 남는 정도로 만들어야 된다는 것입니다. 그래서 이렇게 실사를 이행을 하고 여기 오른쪽에 보시면 실사 선언서를 이후에 출시하기 전에 제출을 해야 되는데 이 선언서 안에 이런 문구가 포함이 되어야 된다고 합니다. 우리는 EU DR에 따라서 실사를 수행을 했고 그 결과 리스크가 없거나 아주 미미한 리스크만을 확인했다는 것을 뭐 이게 컨펌한다 이런 것들을 텍스트를 넣어서 이제 유럽에 제출하라는 것이죠. 책임 있는 조달 관련해서 두 번째는 EU 배터리 규정입니다. 배터리 규정은 non SME, 그러니까 중소기업이 아닌 어떤 경제적 사업자가 배터리를 EU 시장에 출시하거나 관련 서비스를 제공할 때 배터리 듀딜리전스를 실시해야 된다라고 이제 규정을 하고 있습니다. 배터리 듀딜리전스는 뭐냐라고 했을 때 이게 네 가지를 얘기하고 있는데 첫 번째는 배터리 듀딜리전스 정책을 만들어서 제3자로부터 검증을 받으라는 것입니다. 그리고 두 번째는 실사와 관련된 경영 시스템을 만들라는 것인데요. 이때 이제 국제사회사가 얘기하는 어떤 실사 스탠다드를 적용을 하고 탑 매니지먼트 레벨에 실사 책임을 수행할 사람을 지정을 하고 그 다음에 이런 공급망 정책을 실제 계약서에 반영을 하라 이런 내용들이 포함이 되어 있습니다. 그 다음은 리스크 매니지먼트와 관련된 의무인데요. 이 공급망 전체에서 나오는 사회 환경적 리스크를 잘 발견하고 평가를 해서 이게 그 국제사회의 어떤 실사 표준에 맞게 대응 조치를 마련을 하고 그 과정에서 이제 협력업체들과 소통을 하라, 이게 협의를 하라는 것이 이제 세 번째에 들어와 있고요. 네 번째는 이제 정보 공개를 해야 되는데 여기서 보시면 배터리 듀딜리전스 폴리시에 관한 리포트를 대중에게 공개해야 된다는 게 이제 네 번째에 있습니다. 근데 여기 리포트에 중대한 리스크로 우리가 뭘 발견했는지 그리고 어떻게 이걸 해결했는지 그리고 제3자 검증 요약 보고서를 같이 담아야 되고 이 배터리 듀딜리전스 폴리시 리포트는 향후 배터리 여권에 이렇게 포함을 시켜서 누구든지 이 듀딜리전스 리포트를 볼 수 있도록 이제 법 구조가 이렇게 되어 있는 것 같습니다. 네, 그래서 이제 마지막으로 여기 이제 별첨 10을 보면 배터리 듀딜리전스를 할 때 어떤 리스크 항목들을 봐야 되는가, 그래서 환경, 뭐 인권, 사회, 커뮤니티 뭐 이런 내용들이 열거가 되어 있는 것 같습니다. 네, 이상으로 오늘 제 발표를 마치겠습니다. 감사합니다.